If Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? Just ask the question. Because if the person doesn't immediately say yes, if they hesitate or they say no, the problem isn't here, the problem's here. They don't want it to be true. They don't want there to be a God. Why? Because they want to be God.
Coram Deo. Literally what it means is before the face of God. And what Luther was saying simply was this, that the Christian life means to live all of your life in the presence of God.
There is nothing that you can do to automatically make yourself acceptable to the kingdom of God. You can go to church. You can live a decent life. You can be a good, moral, virtuous person, but that does not make you a Christian.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me today for another program of Livin For Christ here on Diggin' Deeper. I am your host, Rihanna, and I am honored to be with you today, and am thankful for your continuance in joining me on this exciting journey. Today's program, we will discuss a simple yet profound truth. God is never changing. That is, God is still who He has always been. Times will change, people will change, places will change, but God does not. In other words, God is still who He has always been, and He anchors everything. In a world that is constantly changing, accelerating, and shifting, this truth offers deep comfort and stability. First, let us get into definitions so we are not talking past one another. When we say God is still who He has always been, we're affirming one of the most foundational truths in Scripture. God does not change. This idea is often called the immutability of God. His nature, character, and purposes are constant, steady, and unshaken, no matter what changes around us. God is not fickle. He does not evolve with culture or shift with the times. What He loved, He still loves. What He hated, He still hates. What He promised, He still fulfills. Think about the world around us. Everything around us shifts: politics, culture, technology, even our own emotions and relationships. But God remains the same. He is holy, loving, faithful. He is loyal and honest. This truth gives us stability. When life is uncertain, we can lean on a God who is always who He has been. Further, it means we can look at His past acts and expect the same heart and hand today. The God who parted the Red Sea still makes a way. The God who walked with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego still steps into fire. The God who forgave David and restored Peter still redeems failure. The God who raised Jesus from the dead still brings life to what seems lost. When we think about God and how He never changes, it makes us feel comfortable. We feel warm and cozy, if you will, because it is not just theology, it is intimacy. This can be hard to understand. I get it, as we live in a world spinning faster than ever, with new technologies, pressures, and distractions every day. It's easy to feel disoriented, like everything is changing, and we are always behind. But one thing has not changed. One thing never will: God. Before we go further into our study, let us look at the idea that God never changes. In a world where everything changes, including people and places, how does God not change? In traditional theology, God is described as immutable, meaning He does not change. This is not a limitation, but a statement about perfection. If God is perfect, any change would imply either becoming better, which means He wasn't perfect before, or worse, which contradicts His perfection. This is a classic line of reasoning in both theology and philosophy about the immutability or unchanging nature of God. Perfection means lacking in nothing. God is fully complete in goodness, knowledge, power, love, and holiness. If God changed for the better, He was not perfect before. If God changed for the worse, He is no longer perfect. Change implies imperfection, either before, after, or both. God is immutable. He does not and cannot change in His nature, character, or being. What we come to understand is that God's nature does not change, but His dealings with people might change depending on their response to Him. Time and time again, we see God's promise of blessing or judgment often comes with a condition. The change is not in God, but in the people's position relative to Him. These change descriptions are anthropomorphic, using human language so we can understand God's actions. God does not change, but He dynamically engages with a changing world. While He may not repeat the same miracles such as parting the Red Sea, make no mistake, God can still make a way where there is no way. He still saves, heals, provides, and speaks, and His power has not diminished. Simply put, God does not repeat miracles like a machine. He moves in fresh, personal, timely ways. What you need today may not look like what Moses needed, but the same God who split the sea is the same God walking you through your storm. Exodus chapter 3, verses 2 and 3, And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. Sometimes God is waiting for us to turn aside, to step away from our pace, our plans, our screens so He can speak. Let us understand that time affects change. But God, being eternal and outside of time, is not subject to the process of change like created beings. When God called Moses, He didn't shout over the noise of the city, or speak through a whirlwind of activity. He waited until Moses had slowed down, until he turned aside from his routine, and noticed a bush that burned but was not consumed. This would have been an important lesson for our program about slowing down, because God often speaks in stillness, not in noise, and certainly not in the hurry we tend to live in. What we learn is, God did not speak until Moses turned aside. He had to slow down, notice, and approach. Only then did God call his name. The scene of Moses and the burning bush is indeed rich with meaning, especially when viewed through the lens of stillness and attentiveness, as God's voice isn't absent, but often unnoticed in the noise and haste of life. God did not speak until Moses turned aside captures a profound spiritual principle. It suggests that divine encounters are not typically imposed or forced. They require a response of intentional awareness. Moses had to interrupt his routine, pay attention, and move toward the mystery. Only then did God speak his name. Let us look at slowing down and how God does not change. We see how slowness creates space for sacred awareness. In a culture of constant motion, slowing down is countercultural, but necessary for deep spiritual life. God speaks in stillness, not chaos. Just as Elijah later found God not in the wind, earthquake, or fire, but in a still small voice, so too here, God waits for our attention, not our busyness. The burning bush wasn't loud, but it was persistent as it drew Moses, not with noise, but with wonder. How many burning bushes do we miss daily because we do not turn aside? Calling comes through attentiveness, as Moses calling into leadership. And deliverance began not with action, but attention. This lesson could be a meaningful invitation for people in your program to embrace slowness, pay attention to the present, and cultivate spiritual awareness. Now, let us look a bit deeper, or let us go digging deeper. In scriptures, God sometimes appears to change, like responding to prayers, or showing anger, then mercy. How is that possible if he doesn't change? Many theologians argue that these descriptions are metaphorical, meant to help humans understand divine actions in human terms. God does not literally change his mind. Rather, our perception of his action shifts based on our own position in time and behavior. We are defining God's nature as unchanging. His essence, character, and will are constant. God's actions that appear to change. His responses to human choices in time appear to change, but they were always consistent with his eternal will. A bigger takeaway is God's nature is unchanging, even if his methods per person, because the project of more life is often to make first state, or actions vary based on the context. In a world marked by change where people, priorities, governments, and cultures constantly shift, God stands alone as unchanging. God's nature, character, and essence are eternally consistent. He is not moody. He is not evolving. He does not become more merciful, more holy, or more loving over time. He is, and always has been, perfect in all his ways. Malachi chapter 3 verse 6. For I am the Lord. I change not. Therefore ye sons of Jacob are not consumed. God's nature, character, and essence are eternally consistent. He is not moody. He is not evolving. He does not become more merciful, more holy, or more loving over time. He is, and always has been, perfect in all his ways. As already discussed, this theological truth is called the immutability of God, meaning that God does not change in his being, his attributes, or his purposes. If you read different stories in the Bible, maybe you'll conclude that God does have a temper and gets moody, so did I just contradict myself? No. Here's why. When we say God is not moody, we mean that God's character doesn't fluctuate based on whims, emotions, or circumstances the way human emotions often do. It's a way of affirming that God is constant, stable, and trustworthy. For example, unlike people who can be joyful one moment and irritable the next, God is always consistent in his nature. His love, justice, mercy, holiness, and wisdom remain the same throughout eternity. Hebrews chapter 13 verse 8, Jesus Christ the same yesterday, and today, and forever. We may get moody based on tiredness, stress, offense, or disappointment. But God's actions and decisions are never impulsive or emotionally unstable. His responses are always grounded in perfect wisdom, righteousness, and love. The Bible shows God expressing anger or displeasure at times, like with Abraham, Moses, and many others, but it is important to understand how his anger is different from human emotions. Like being moody. When God gets angry, it's always because of sin, injustice, or disobedience, things that harm his creation or break his covenant. His anger is never arbitrary, irrational, or impulsive like a human mood swing. It is a holy, purposeful response aimed at correction, justice, or protection. If you have ever watched these programs, you know that I do not get too deep into philosophy, and usually theology. On this episode of Livin For Christ, I have gotten way deeper into both, but I needed to in order to express the significance of the respective situation. Let us go digging deeper into the idea of God is still the same today as he was yesterday. For example, at times, it may seem like God changes his mind or approach, but what actually changes are the circumstances, or the people's response to him, not God himself. Think of God as an author and the world as a book, and in many ways, this is the case. God is the creator of the world, the author, and the world is his creation, a book. The story unfolds moment by moment for the characters, but the author sees the whole story at once. God, being outside of time, sees all of history, past, present, future, in a single eternal now. This is very difficult for so many to fathom. So, while creation changes, God's view and will encompass all change without himself being altered. In any story, the characters may not understand everything, the plot twists, the suffering, or the purpose of certain events. But if the author is good and wise, the story has meaning. The paradox is this: God's love does not change, yet it is felt freshly every day. His mercy does not grow, but we experience it anew. His justice is fixed, yet it applies specifically in each situation. One of the most comforting truths for believers is that God doesn't stop loving us when we mess up. He is not like a person who gives affection one day and pulls it away the next. His grace is not moody, it is steady and sure. Because he is not moody, you never have to wonder which version of God you will get today. He is always good, always just, always merciful, always holy. All of this matters is, if God does not change, his promises remain trustworthy. His character is consistent, always just, always loving, always holy. In a world full of uncertainty and flux, a changeless God is a source of stability and hope. The Bible contains several explicit statements and narrative examples that highlight the truth that God does not change in his character, purposes, promises, or nature. From Malachi, God reassures his people that his faithfulness and covenant love remain, even though they have strayed. His constancy is the reason they are not destroyed. God's unchanging nature preserves his mercy and his covenant. Let us look at Adam, to Noah, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Israel. We see that even as generations change, locations shift, from Canaan to Egypt to the wilderness, but God's covenant promise never fails. God remains a covenant-keeping God across centuries and changing generations. Despite the shifting generations, geographies, and human failures, God remains steadfast in his covenant faithfulness. As we trace the biblical story from Adam to Noah to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the formation of Israel, one truth stands firm. God remains faithful. He is a covenant-keeping God. Though Adam sinned and brought separation between man and God, the Lord gave the first glimpse of a coming redemption. Even in judgment, God makes a promise, a covenant of hope, that a Redeemer would come to crush the serpent. This promise threads through all generations that follow. In Noah's time, the earth was filled with violence and corruption. God judged the world through the flood, but preserved Noah and his family. God made a covenant with Noah, and this was God's promise of preservation, a sign that he would never again destroy the earth with a flood. Even as the earth changed, God's faithfulness remained. Generations after Noah, God calls Abram out of Ur and establishes a personal and eternal covenant with him, and this covenant was reaffirmed in Genesis chapters 15 and 17, and it wasn't based on Abraham's perfection but God's sovereign grace. Even when Abraham wavered, God did not. After Abraham, the promise continues through Isaac. The same covenant is reconfirmed because God doesn't abandon his word with each generation. His promise is multi-generational. Jacob, though flawed and deceptive, is chosen by God. At Bethel, God appears to him in a dream and renews the covenant even after all Jacob had done. God remains true. He does not change his mind because of man's weakness. He remains faithful to his covenant. Jacob would later become Israel, the father of the 12 tribes. And we can go on and on with how this spirals and continues, but it is important to understand that while people and places and situations change, God's nature does not. He is still the same. He is still the same God today as he was yesterday, and this should give us hope. We could go on and on through David and the kings, the prophets, and the exile through Bethlehem, Calvary, and an empty tomb. The story unfolds generation after generation, location after location, struggle after struggle. And yet, one thing remains unchanged. God's nature is unchanging. In times of chaos and cultural confusion, when everything feels uncertain, this truth is our anchor. This is not just a nice idea, it is the foundation of our confidence. So slow down, breathe, remember. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is your God. The God who kept his covenant across centuries is keeping you today. The God who never changes is still working, still speaking, still moving, and still loving you with an everlasting love. Let us end on some famous words from famous Christian minds. A.W. Tozer writes, "There is no change in God. Thus, he is our rock, our fortress, our anchor in the storm." A.W. Pink. All that God is, he has always been, and all that he has been and is, he will ever be. The legendary Billy Graham, what God is, he always is. Nothing about him ever changes. His love, his mercy, his truth, his justice remain forever the same. Again, from A.W. Pink. The permanence of God's character guarantees the fulfillment of his promises. And again from A.W. Tozer in The Knowledge of the Holy, God never changes moods, or cools off in his affections, or loses enthusiasm. Wayne Grudem in Systematic Theology, God is unchangeable in his being, perfections, purposes, and promises. From Rick Warren, in a world of constant change, God and his word are the only constants you can depend on. The late Charles Stanley, God's nature is unchanging. His love, grace, and truth are not fleeting. They are eternal. Charles Spurgeon explains, the immutability of God is a comfort to the believer. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And from Tim Keller, because God is immutable, he is as kind today as he was yesterday, and will be just as kind tomorrow. If you enjoyed this program, please like and share our content with others so we can continue to spread the word of God as far as it will go. I am your host, Rihanna, for Livin For Christ from Diggin' Deeper. Until next time, stay safe and God bless.